The Individualized Plan for Employment, or IPE, presented by PACER's Project Launch and the National Disability Rights Network. Our speakers today are Ron and Amy of the National Disability Rights Network. This is a RAISE webinar that was funded by the Rehab Service Administration.
So I'm going to talk about the Individualized Plan for Employment, otherwise known as the IPE, not to be confused with the Individualized Education Plan, the IEP, which can be quite confusing since the acronyms are so similar using the same three letters. But what we're talking about here is the IPE, which is the Plan for Employment for the individual. So the written IPE, which is what I'm going to refer to it going forward, includes the individual's employment goal and specific services to reach that goal. And very, very important advocacy tip here, if you're working with individuals who are in the process of writing their IPE, or you're working with VR to help individuals do that, you want to try to make the IPE as clear as possible from the beginning and as specific as possible, so that everyone is on the same page and there's agreement as to especially what the employment goal is and what services are needed. Sometimes the problems come about later in the process when it's just vaguely written, or not everyone is clear about what the employment goal is and how you're going to get there. So advocacy tip, just try to make it as clear and as specific as you can from the beginning. You could also have, as part of the IPE, a comprehensive assessment as necessary to determine employment outcome, objectives, nature, and scope of VR services. And this is really important because not everyone that walks into the VR office is going to know, I absolutely know that I want to become an English teacher, as Mario does, but especially high school students. I mean, who really knew what you wanted to do when you were a senior in high school? So VR can help to determine those things and help an individual explore their options through assessments as part of the IPE. It also may include a referral for rehab technology services, otherwise known as assistive technology, or AT for short, to assess and develop the capacities of the individual to perform in a work environment. And notice, this is at the beginning of the process when you're just developing the individualized plan for employment. It is possible to do an AT evaluation, and that is very important as well, because sometimes you'll hear from VR, well, we'll worry about what the AT options might be once the person is employed or has a job offer. Then we'll figure out what type of assessment to do. But that really is too late in the process for so many people, because if you do the AT assessment at the beginning, it may even change the job options that are on the table and the type of training the person might be able to pursue. So it's really important to remember that the AT assessment can happen at the beginning of the IPE development, and really it should happen if it's relevant to that person. It should happen as early on in the process as possible. And we talked about this a little bit already, but informed choice is really, really important. Again, this is designed to be a client-directed process, and you want to have respect for the individual dignity, personal responsibility, self-determination, and pursuit of meaningful careers based on what the individuals with disabilities say they want to do. Now, this is a great discussion to have and a great concept to discuss. Sometimes it's not executed as well on VR's end as it could be, because they don't always present all the choices that could be presented to the client. And sometimes it can be a situation where a box is checked on a piece of paper saying that the client was given choices throughout the VR process. So you really want to make sure, if you're involved in this advocacy, that the choices are actually presented and the person involved does have the ability to make a choice between different options. But again, going back to the congressional language, it really is supposed to be a consumer-driven program, because that's what's going to be most effective in getting people jobs. I mean, who really wants to do a job that they're not interested in doing? And you're not going to be very motivated. You may not work very hard. So that's why it's really important, especially with the employment goals, that we are looking at what the client or consumer wants to do. So there are a number of requirements in terms of what has to go into the IPE. And as you probably guessed by now, the employment outcome is a big part of that. Also, services to be provided. And we're about to talk in a few minutes about what those services would be. And luckily, it's a very wide range of services that can help the client get to their employment outcome. There also should be a timeline. So you're going to try to set goals and dates and things like that to say when certain services are going to be completed, when certain goals are going to be reached in order for the person to get to their ultimate employment outcome. But as we'll talk about later too, that timeline is not set in stone. It can change as other things change, and you're not tied to specific dates that are in the initial IPE. Nonetheless, they should be there in order to guide the process. Also, there should be information about who's providing the services. And then this is another area where informed choice really comes into the process, because the client should be given choices about which vendors or entities they want to use to get the services that they're discussing. You also want to have the criteria for evaluating the progress, and that should be tracked. And then also the responsibilities of VR, individual or other agencies if applicable. And that's another situation where you want to try to be as clear as possible in terms of who is responsible for what, so that, 3 months into working with the client, there's not a huge argument about VR saying, well, I thought this other agency was paying for it, and the other agency saying, I thought VR was paying for it. If you can get that laid out in the IPE from the beginning, it can make things a lot easier. Next slide. The IPE must be reviewed at least annually, and notice the phrase there, at least. So you've got to do it at least once a year, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen more often. And as things are changing or different things develop, you should be definitely willing or encouraging VR and the client to review the IPE. As I mentioned on the previous slide, it must be amended if necessary due to changes in the employment outcome. And that happens a lot. People start out with one job goal, and then they get, maybe even a year into the process and decide, that's not what I want to do. So it's possible to go back and change that. It's also possible to go back and change VR services, or again, who is providing the VR service to the individual, the entities or the vendors providing the services. So all of that, if any of those things change, the IPE needs to be amended. And it's important to note that the IPE can be amended at any time. There's not a time frame in which that would have to happen. I mean, you may have, 5 or 6 amendments, in 1 year if things really change, or if the person decides to go in a different direction. And there's no limit on how many changes can be made. But it is important to note that the changes will not take place until they're agreed to by the individual and the VR counselor. So they have to be on the same page. And as you might imagine, that can sometimes create conflict if those two individuals are not on the same page. But it's important, again, that we're listening to the informed choices of the client and what changes that client would like to have, and the VR counselor should do everything they can to help them reach that goal. Next slide.
There's a question that came up on that right then. I think might as well take it now.
Okay.
Review it every year. From what date? The sign date, the start of the position, or another time frame? What's the typical time frame for the annual review?
Yeah, that's a great question. And different VR agencies may do it differently, but I think the first option that you suggested is probably the best one, to review it from the day that the IPE is signed. And it is really important. I don't think we talked about this specifically, but you want to make sure that you get signatures by both the client and the counselor on the IPE, because that's what really puts it into effect. And so it would make sense then, if you signed it on that particular date, to then do a review a year later from the sign date. So that's probably the best practice. There might be other approaches to that, but I would say generally the date the IPE is signed. And then for closing the record of services, the stage that we hope that everyone gets to, because this is the ultimate goal, and this occurs, the case is closed when a person is able to achieve and maintain employment for at least 90 days. So that's not a really long period of time, but hopefully it's long enough to at least be able to assess the situation, figure out if this is the right job match for the person, and if the person is doing well and stable on the job. Now, again, it's really important, as I was talking about on the previous slide, that there is agreement between the individual and VR that the outcome is satisfactory and the individual is performing well. As you might also imagine, sometimes there's disagreement here. VR sometimes, wants to close the case because they are tracking how many successful closures they get per year, and they want that number to be as high as possible. So they would like to do it quickly. So sometimes they want to close the case, but the individual's like, no, this job isn't working, or I'm not satisfied. And so that is why both people need to be on the same page before the case is officially closed. And then the other great thing, though, about the way that VR is set up is there's something called post-employment services. And what that means is that this would be, you are working, you're doing well, your case has been closed, but all of a sudden something happens on the job. Maybe there's a change in job duties from when you initially started the job, and you need some support in order to maintain the job that you have. Perhaps it's maybe even just having someone come in and change the work setup or change the way the equipment is laid out for the new duty that you have to do. But the overall goal is that VR can come in even when the case has been closed and try to provide any support that would be needed to help that individual maintain the job that they have. Now, just a note about that, it's not intended to be a long-term service. So if you're going into post-employment services, it should be something that's relatively brief, easy to perform, and not something that would be, again, long-term investment in money or time. If that was the case, then you'd probably have to reopen the case again and start providing services under a new case. But if there's something that can be done in the short term to allow the person to maintain their job, then that is certainly allowable and can be a really good service to help people maintain the job that they have.
Thank you for watching, and a special thanks to Ron and Amy of the National Disability Rights Network. This is a RAISE webinar that was funded by the Rehab Service Administration. Pacer Center is here to help. Contact us at transition@pacer.org or pacer@pacer.org, or call us at 952-838-9000, or look more at our resources at pacercenter.org/transition.